In Part 5 of Why Was the Third Earliest Party in the United States Opposed to Freemasonry, we will discuss the first statewide Anti-Masonic Convention, Eli Bruce's trial, and the politics of the newly formed Anti-Masonic Party. If you haven't already seen Parts 1 through 4, you should do that now and come back here later. Look for the links at the top of this page. If you've already seen 1 through 4, welcome back to my channel where I question history as we know it. If you enjoy this content, you know what to do. It is in February of 1828 that the first statewide Anti-Masonic Convention was held in Leroy, with 12 western New York counties being represented. One of the leaders of this convention was David Bernard, who was, if you recall, a Baptist minister that had been the first Mason to renounce his membership following Morgan's disappearance. 35 Masons signed a document publicly renouncing the fraternity and verified that Morgan's illustration of Masonry description of the first 3 degrees was accurate and truthful. Bernard asked for their support in publishing all the degrees following the third, and this endeavor, of course, as previously mentioned, would prove successful when Light on Masonry is published later in 1829 and is regarded as the Anti-Masonic Bible. A committee is also formed at the convention to create a testimonial to send to Congress asking on whose authority Morgan was held at Fort Niagara, and resolved to meet again for another statewide convention in August. Governor Clinton died suddenly on February 11, 1828. Side fact. He was and is the only governor in New York history to die while in office. In March, the acting governor, Nathaniel Pitcher, sent a message to the Senate asking for a law that would allow for the appointment of a special attorney for the ongoing trials and investigations into the abduction of Morgan to ensure the democratic process would be upheld. Within a month, the bill was created, passed by the Senate, and became law in April of 1828. Congressman Albert Tracy presented the testimonial created at the Leroy Convention to the House of Representatives. After it had been read, members of the House argued about what the proper course of action should be. They finally decided to refer the petition to the then-sitting President, John Quincy Adams, for consideration. It was quickly forgotten, however, and accounts state that this is the only recorded instance of a discussion by Congress about anti-Masonry during this time. On July 4, 1828, another convention in Leroy marked the peak of the evangelical influence on anti-Masonry. The chairman was Solomon Southwick, a former Mason, and then the editor of an anti-Masonic newspaper, the Albany National Observer, which was at that time the leading state journal of anti-Masonry. The most notable event was the Declaration of Independence from the Masonic Institution, which was signed by 103 seating Masons, indicating the number and type of degrees taken. The declaration claimed that Freemasonry was, quote, opposed to the genius and design of this government, the spirit and precepts of our holy religion, and the welfare of society generally. The Anti-Masons did not nominate any political candidates at their Leroy convention, however, and at least one newspaper suggested that the failure of the convention to name a candidate for governor had been a scheme of Thurlow Weed's, who was an adamant John Quincy Adams supporter, and that he had intended to give Adamsmen an opportunity to nominate someone that both parties could agree on, and later endorse that candidate at another anti-Masonic meeting. Essentially proving this to be true, Weed directed his own convention in late July in Utica, arranging for Francis Granger, a state assemblyman from Canandaigua with anti-Masonic principles, to receive the lieutenant governor nomination. But Adams' men had refused to join this convention and had held theirs 2 weeks prior, nominating Judge Smith Thompson for governor and also Francis Granger, now partly associated with anti-Masonry, for lieutenant governor. Thurlow had been present at this convention, but not as a representative. Evidently disgruntled with Weed and Friends' leadership and also unwilling to compromise, the Anti-Masons held a separate convention on August 4th, nominating Granger for governor, hoping he would accept their offer for first place on the ticket rather than second place like Weed and Adams' men had. Granger took 3 weeks to make up his mind, and in the meantime, Eli Bruce's trial was finally set to begin. In his autobiography, Thurlow Weed states that it had been deemed important to secure Elisha Adams' testimony at Bruce's trial. Adams was an old disabled soldier staying at Fort Niagara while Morgan was being held there. He had disappeared not long after the investigations had begun and was wanted in the state of Vermont. Weed tracked down his location and with the help of the county sheriff arrived at the house Adams was staying late in the night so as to surprise him. Once they were inside, Adams claimed he had been expecting them and was ready to go quickly. He traveled back to Canandaigua with Weed to testify. On the way, Adams asked Weed to bring him up to date on the information obtained about Morgan's kidnapping and the news of the trials. As Weed did so, Adams would either confirm or deny the evidence the committees had collected. He admitted to Weed that he had heard noises coming from the magazine and had alerted Edward Giddens, the keeper of the fort, who told him that someone was staying there who would soon be taken to his friends in Canada, but no mention should be made of it. Adams said he brought Morgan food a couple of times, and was later told to have a boat ready for Morgan and those who would take him away. He states that about midnight, several men emerged from a carriage to escort the person in the magazine. Adams was told to wait on the dock until the boat came back in case he needed to warn them. With no signal needed, Adams claimed that the boat returned quickly with 5 men instead of the 6 it began with, and so he assumed that the stranger from the magazine had been taken to his friends in Canada. However, when it came time to testify, Elisha Adams emphatically denied any knowledge of Morgan, any abduction, or anyone being kept at Fort Niagara at all, failing to shed any light on the case. To continue this ridiculousness, Edward Giddens was called. Giddens was a Royal Archmason and the lighthouse and ferry keeper at Fort Niagara while Morgan was being held there. But the defense refused to allow him to be sworn in on the grounds that he was an unbeliever in the Christian religion, and witnesses were then called to prove this to be true. When it had been heard several times that Giddens did not believe in God and thought that the Bible was a book for children, the judge declared that he could not be a competent witness, since he, quote, denied the existence of the supreme being that holds us accountable for our actions. And so the testimony of Giddens was fully rejected. At least one account states that he had attended the first meeting in Leroy, where he and other Masons renounced their membership. This account claims that he had appeared at the meeting as a confessed and repentant criminal, announcing that he and the others in fact locked Morgan in the magazine for several days. He states that Morgan was taken across the river to Canada, but that when the Canadian Masons would not take him, they brought him back to the magazine where Giddens was his keeper. Edward goes on to say that there were several discussions of killing Morgan with 5 or 6 Masons present, all in agreement that Morgan had forfeited his life according to the laws of the institution. He says that the hesitancy of 2 Masons delayed Morgan's murder, but when he himself became hesitant and suggested that they release Morgan, the others forced Giddens to give up his keys. So he left the fort, and upon his return, Morgan was no longer present there. Though Giddens was supposedly not around to witness the actual murder, if his account was truthful, he believed that Morgan was murdered and his body was thrown into the Niagara River on September 19, 1826. Later, Edward Giddens published years' worth of Anti-Masonic Almanacs, including his statement of facts detailing this information. There's a link to a digital copy of one of those in the description box below if you're interested in seeing one. During Bruce's testimony, he says that he was under the impression that Morgan was coming voluntarily, based on his wish to get away from Miller. Bruce states that he had been requested to prepare a cell at Lockport, where Morgan could stay until he could be taken to Canada. He tells the court that on the morning of September the 14th, he and his companions crossed the river to Canada, with Morgan in the boat, expecting to be received by others. When this did not happen, he and his companions thought it best to wait a few days. They brought Morgan back to Fort Niagara and put him in the magazine to wait until the arrangements had been made, which he said were to place Morgan on a farm in the interior of Canada. Bruce testified that he had not seen Morgan since and had no knowledge of what happened to him after that morning. He was sentenced to 28 months, and on appeal, the execution of his imprisonment was postponed until May of 1829. Thurlow tells us in his autobiography that Elisha Adams came to him later to explain why he had not answered honestly at Bruce's trial. He said that on the evening they had arrived in Canandaigua, Eli Bruce's lawyers had met with him to tell him that if he had told what he knew, he would be implicating himself, and that it would be used against him. So the only way for him not to incriminate himself was to say that he didn't know anything about it, and so that's what he did. Back in the political sphere, Francis Granger chose to go with the Adams Party. Shocked, the Anti-Masons held yet another convention on September 7th and nominated Solomon Southwick for governor instead. Southwick ultimately proved to be an embarrassment of a candidate, especially to political realists like Weed. He and others felt Solomon's views were too extreme to develop new recruits and described him as unsound, vain, and egotistical. Weed was careful not to reference Southwick's candidacy in his Anti-Masonic Inquirer until September 30th, and on October 7th, he begrudgingly placed Southwick's name at the head of the Anti-Masonic ticket, convinced that a majority of antis would vote for him anyway. Southwick was defeated. However, the 1828 elections was a turning point for anti-Masons. As the movement spread from New York to other states like Vermont, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Massachusetts, and Maryland, anti-Masonic candidates started winning seats in these state legislatures. In fact, our 13th president, Millard Fillmore, was elected to the New York legislature on an anti-Masonic ticket. On a national level, the anti-Masons became the first third party to elect candidates to Congress. If you're enjoying this content, remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and check out the links in the description box below. Big shout out to Leonardo for joining my Patreon. Thank you so much for your support. I appreciate you, and I look forward to all of your comments. And part 6 is coming up next.